About is academic trends. So I'm going to make some other things I may not go to enough explanation. So please feel free to raise your hand and tell me to speak slower or speak louder or whatever you like. But let me start by introducing myself. Should I start or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I was supposed to read the introduction.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We want to get to know each other.
I think it's okay.
Okay.
Professor Tom Lee from the University of Washington.
I'm Professor Tom Lee from the University of Washington. I've been there since 1983-84 school year. It's one of those phenomena where, you know, the days, the weeks, things roll by, and the next thing you know, I'm in my 19th year. It's just startling. I've also mentioned that it's one of those small world phenomena. I went to school at the University of Oregon, and that was technically Rosalie and I overlapped one year. She was just leaving the University of Oregon, and I was just arriving at the University of Oregon. I don't associate any cause-effect here, so at least I hope not. I did my master's degree at Bowling Green State University. I don't know if you're familiar with that part of the country. It's Ohio, flat as a pancake. You could roll a bowling ball across the entire state. And you have to anticipate it, sort of imagine. I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, where kind of a radical place, and then you go to someplace in the Midwest, and that was stunning, if nothing else. Plus, also, growing up in the California environment, I didn't know what winter was. I mean, I honestly did not know what winter was. I thought, well, okay, it's the Midwest, buy a jacket, how cold can it be? I'll tell you, that was a cultural experience. And I did my doctorate at the University of Oregon, sort of became a Northwest kind of person. Perhaps the most salient thing right now about me, and perhaps the reason I'm here, is that I'm also the editor of the Academy of Management Journal. I've been its associate editor since 1997, or one of its associate editors since 1997. And I just assumed the editorship. It's a 3-year term, calendar year 2002 to the end of calendar year 2004. Why that's particularly relevant here is that once you get a title, I've discovered, people think you know a lot more than you really do. Moreover, I found that once you get a title, it's sort of like, do we pick somebody without a title or pick somebody with a title? And they say, well, this guy's got more letters before or after his name, and therefore he or she must be the person you want to talk to. And it just happens that, just fortuitously, I've had this opportunity to get involved with some Asian issues in management. It is, I will confess to you, not something that is planned. It's not something that is thought out in some rational economic fashion. It is something that sort of just happened. So let me start by saying, are there any questions? I was mentioning for those who just walked in, I also speak Norwegian of all things. I always like to say that because on the face of it, it doesn't look like I speak Norwegian. Well, what? I was wondering if anybody get that joke. I sort of test out the audience. Humor works or not. Well, what is management?
Well, in northern Norway and Finland, they do have slightly.
Yeah,
and there's even a theory that Finnish is related to Japanese. So there you are. You're in. You're okay.
It
was your roots, after all.
I was once asked in Norway what my name was. I said, well, Tom Lee. The person said, oh, that's Norwegian. Are you from northern Norway? And my first reaction was, I don't know what they look like up there, but not my stereotype. 6-foot Scandinavian named Knut. Well, I studied management in Asia generally and China in particular. Well, I think there are several reasons. Among them, one is, I cannot deny this. This is a personal history. I'm the offspring of immigrant parents. This is one of these glamorous kind of stories, sort of thing historically. They were a part of an arranged marriage. You know, in the year 2002, it's very hard to think of your family getting together and say, oh, you guys are getting married, by the way. And because they're in the United States, had they really, really insisted, they probably could have not gotten married, but the pressure there was to get married, and they were married for over 50 years. It's kind of a stunning phenomenon, like maybe in today's world. Well, I also grew up hearing on a day-to-day basis about China, life in China, pre-1949, life in China in particular. So my images of China probably don't exist anymore. What I know about China is the historical events. And I was talking to a number of people here. I speak a dialect called Khoisan. I spoke Khoisan before I spoke English. And so last year I had the great privilege of going to Beijing, and I knew nobody there, not even close, would speak Khoisan, so I didn't ask. But when I got to Hong Kong, I thought, okay, now there's an outside chance. So I went to the sort of the pillars of society, people who know everything. So I went to all the cab drivers and started asking them, does anybody here speak Khoisan? I got a very uniform answer. Everybody would turn and sort of stare at me like I was from outer space and say, I thought you had to be 90 years old to speak that one. It was just like, oh, okay. Sort of like in the United States and in Canada, there aren't too many Khoisan speaking people anymore. Well, so there's this personal interest in speaking, learning about Chinese management. But as an academic, why do you study it? One of the most common explanations why you want to study something is also, in my opinion, the most unconvincing. You hear things, there is a paucity of existing research. I think that's the stupidest reason to study anything. I think a very legitimate counter-explanation for why there's a paucity of research is that the topic is not interesting, fundamentally. And so that alternative explanation never seems to come into a lot of people's minds. Well, I think there are, however, a whole bunch of good reasons to study them, of which we have to put these in a Western, sort of an Eastern context, excuse me. One is that there is, in Asia in general, I think this is quite true, that there's increased attention to public sentiment. There is this sense of this Westernization, this sense of, gosh, if nothing else, we have to be somewhat cognizant of CNN. I mean, if your face is in CNN all the time, or if the press is there all the time, this is going to affect your behavior. I also, this is a minor point perhaps, but Burma, historically a very, very totalitarian, authoritative society, even that kind of society is listening to public opinion and trying to make some political accommodations. I love this. I was watching CNN, the war in Afghanistan, et cetera, and just for me, one of those moments that put a different spin on how you view things from the Asian perspective. They were interviewing the Afghan warlords, and they were talking about the Geneva Convention, prisoners, and they were talking about humane treatment. These two warlords were sitting there, it's like, what is going on here? We take prisoners, don't we? In the past, we never did that. And I thought, oh, prisoners in the past? Whoa, that sounds like something like 5,000 BC. And the simple fact that these people are now taking prisoners was a sense of, this is a monumental step forward in human relations. That is a very different perspective. I also think that there is some notion here of workplace liberalization, improved working conditions. Now, I gotta confess to you, I have a very strong Western mentality. So I had this wonderful opportunity to go see a sweatshop in Beijing. And so my first reaction was very Western. I walked in there and I saw, oh my gosh, the electric outlets, and they have 19 things plugged into one outlet. I kept thinking, what is a fire waiting to happen? Then you had OSHA violations, safety violations, every which way. People were so close together, I kept thinking, if somebody screamed and just jumped up, they'd knock over 4 or 5 different sewing machines. And I thought, geez, if you just had some emergency, you're going to get up and run out there, you're going to knock everything over, and all kinds of accidents would happen. But the sense was, in talking to the people there, that they were now cognizant of this, and they said, well, you can only do so much so quickly. But the idea was, there is this sense of workplace liberalization, if nothing else, to perhaps what you and I consider an everyday assumed phenomenon. There, the idea was the simple fact that somebody's even concerned about potential fire hazards. I'll also confess to you, I went to a number of, in Beijing, I went to a number of, I can't think of a better word to describe it, but sort of department stores. They're essentially stalls where people set up their businesses. And I was on the 8th floor. There was no elevator. It was stairs. And I kept thinking, gosh, if there's a fire here, I'm just dead beat. I'm just not going to survive this. And suddenly I started thinking about, I take for granted fire-resistant construction equipment. I take for granted fire escapes. I take for granted fire hoses, things which might save one's life. And I was thinking, okay, from the perspective then of going from very little concern about that to having some is just kind of a major phenomenon. I think workplace liberalization suggests that the world is changing there. I'm going to add some more reasons also, but these are sort of, I think, some of the more compelling ones. Increased globalization. Now that's one we hear all the time. And what does that sort of translate to? One, I think, is if we sort of look at what's going on in Asia, one is labor-intensive manufacturing is leaving, for example, Korea. And I teach in a Korean MBA program where the LG group pretty much sponsors it. And they are very cognizant that their competitive advantage for a long time was very cheap labor. But they are losing that competitive advantage because things now are apparently going to Latin America. Thai, Malay managers are investing in higher technology equipment in anticipation of losing their labor price advantage. So is there a sense of, in studying Asia, what we traditionally think of cheap labor areas, traditional areas of, well, their competitive advantage will be, you just don't have to be concerned about the workforce, you don't have to be concerned about the human resources. That fundamentally is changing. I think these dramatic changes are reasons to study China, Asia. And I think, if nothing else, the Asian impact on the West Coast, the Asian impact on the world. We all remember the crisis that happened in 1997. I think the slowdown right now in year 2001 is still affecting us. Even if we do have a V-shaped recovery, or I'm pessimistic, I think we're going to have more of an L-shaped recovery. The simple fact that our trading partners are out there and hurting, I think this implies that we should understand what's going on there. And I think probably the most dramatic one might be China's massive market. We're talking 1 billion people there, and I think it's sort of encapsulated. We have a 15-year effort to achieve China's entrance into the World Trade Organization that was achieved in late 2001. I think this is, all these things come together and make this area kind of an interesting place to study. And I'm going to preface some comments here. One thing I've noticed about this thing, I have to confess, I do not know whether this was in fact French, but whenever you read in the magazine, they always attribute it to an old adage. One thing I've noticed about management in Asia, management in China in particular, that old French adage, the more things change, the more things stay the same. It is the darndest idea, and I hope to make that theme come across a bit more. Please feel free to ask questions if you would like. This is not one of those lectures with 400 people. You'll be a bit more intimate here. Well, overview of the Chinese business context in particular. I'm going to start with a story. This is 1985. In 1985, I did not know a lot about Chinese business. I did not know a lot about Chinese management. And there were just, I think, a larger number of students coming to American universities. This particular individual was a mid-level bureaucrat. He was trying to get an MBA at the University of Washington. And for whatever reason, he gravitated towards me, and we went out and had a beer, and we were sort of chatting. And I said, okay, I've read about Chinese management, I've read about Chinese society. How do you survive? How do you live your life on a day-to-day basis? How do you envision success? You envision what you're supposed to be doing. This is in 1985, Deng Xiaoping, the reforms. The questions were whether it was real or whether it was just another passing thing. And so I asked this guy. He says, oh, it's very simple. This is very simple. He says, it's been true for 2,000 years. I said, oh, what's this? Give me the wisdom. And he says, use all your intellectual abilities, use all your talents to avoid making a decision. He says, no matter what you do, just don't make a decision. I said, this is not what we teach in America. And so he said, you explain this to me. And he was saying, you got to think of the context. You may make a decision. Deng Xiaoping may survive. He may do things that are going to last 10 years. How do you know it's going to survive 12 years from now? This year you may be a hero. Next year you may be in big trouble. And so if you want to survive the course of your life and you want to have a comfortable lifestyle, the way you deal with the bureaucracy is to become part of it. And whatever you do, you don't make a decision. You blend in and you pass it on to whomever. Oh my gosh, this has been going on for thousands of years. And you think, how can this work? And you pause and say, well, son of a gun, it's worked. I mean, it's been there for thousands of years. That was one of those eye-opening moments. In talking about this context, I think what we want to draw from that story is that we really don't know a whole lot about the larger Chinese business environment, or so we think. I'm going to come back, I hope, over and over again. I hope this theme will things stay the same. Well, in talking about sort of this overview of the Chinese business environment, the first thing you'd want to talk about, perhaps, this stems from Rosalie's work, perhaps, and some others, about Guanxi. Now, I will confess to you, I'm never sure how to pronounce that, because in my dialect it could be anything. Guanxi? 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 I've always said Guanxi, so I just learned something new. And for me, I think what this gets to, we're talking about a business environment where a larger norm is somehow focused around relationships, and we call this social identity. For example, firms provide a social identity to employees through your income, your health insurance, your medical care, housing, loan, this kind of paternalistic, the sense of connection to one another. Firms have interdependent, overlapping structures of the Chinese Communist Party. This was one of those also. I always think I must be very naive about this area because I'm constantly having these eye-opening revelations. I was having the fortune of chatting with the associate dean of the Peking University Business School, and we were sort of chatting about Chinese business schools. On the face of it, my sense was, okay, this is a communist society. I understand you have to have management programs, but Adam Smith, the Western ideas of capitalism, you have to bring these ideas in. Is there some sort of conflict here? And you say, oh, no. I said, okay, how's this? He said, well, let's think of our structure. I said, okay, what's your structure? He said, first we have a dean. And the dean is the chief executive officer. He deals primarily with top-level government people. He deals with external relations. He deals with all the people you have to deal with. I said, fine, that makes sense to me. He said, then there's a chief internal officer, the associate dean, whom I was speaking with, and he handles the academic affairs of the university, of the business school, including faculty research, faculty outreach, trying to make the school more credible in the eyes of business schools around the world. And he said, then we have the party dean. My first reaction was, party dean? You guys know how to do well. You have a dean for our parties? He says, no. Not how you think. He says, it is the dean who is the one who must interact with the Communist Party. And I said, my gosh, what does that mean? He said, technically, that person has to approve all syllabi, has to approve all course materials, all books selected. And I said, whoa. I mean, just from my background, that is a violation of academic freedom. And I was thinking, well, maybe you don't have that here. He said, well, if you talk about Guanxi, and you talk about relationships, a set of trust occurs. You have this idea of what you're allowed to do and what you can do, and you have to do it within the viewpoint of this associate dean who represents the party. So you have all these external constraints, and you aren't told what you have to do, but over time, you have to come to realize what you can do and what you cannot do. And this is that notion of social interaction, dealing with people, and if you guess wrong, you're going to get binged on the head, and if you guess right, life goes on. And employees develop a dependence on their supervisors for housing, insurance, vacations, and leaves. So there's this oneness, this wholeness, identity, if you will, with the organization. And that goes beyond what we might have in the United States. I harken back to that story from 1985 when I asked the guy, gee, how do you survive in the Chinese context? How do you just life on a day-to-day basis? And I realized later on that part of what he was talking about was capsulized by, you see it, Contract Management Responsibility System, CMRS, came out in the early 80s. Now, I will tell you also, I love this because I don't know how many of you remember being undergraduates or deal with undergraduates, but when you talk about the 1980s, particularly with undergraduates, this is ancient history on the part of Rome, or we're talking World War II, World War I, the Civil War, 1980s, there's like Ronald Reagan way back there. And you think, oh my gosh, just doesn't seem that long ago to me. But nonetheless, you talk to a lot of people, this will date you perhaps, you talk to undergraduates today, rock and roll music started in 1996. Prior to that, it was just sort of noise. You think, oh my gosh, 1996. So when you talk about the early 80s to many people, that seems like just way, way back there. What were they trying to do? They were trying to do was trying to establish responsibilities. They were trying to get a sense of what you cannot do. Clearly, you want to improve organizational performance, improve enterprise performance, improve autonomy. You're trying to increase income for the state. But the idea of what you're doing was you're trying to get a sense of what you can do and what you cannot do. And this was in the early 80s. And you think about coming out of Mao had died, in the late 70s, I believe, and Deng Xiaoping was the sense of well, we're going to, he called it communism, Chinese style. And, Western ideas were coming in. There was a sense of, yeah, it might hold, it might not. Sort of don't know what was going on. And I think in academic terms, it moved organizations somehow to operate between market influences. We never have pure markets, and we never have pure bureaucracy, except for maybe universities. That joke didn't occur over well. Every time I tell that joke in a university setting, it goes over again. Yeah, bureaucracies, universities. Well, in the early 80s, they were trying to introduce the issue of markets within the context of the Chinese bureaucracy. I think what happened was that it moved firms into trying to figure out into the schizophrenic phase of, gosh, I'm trying to work within the Chinese structure, the party system, trying to work with acute, intensive allocation of resources based on the state, and trying to deal with markets. My image, my thoughts, this may be relevant because of Enron, etc. In the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about Russian accounting, and they talked somewhat about Chinese accounting. And I thought, okay, most of us have this idea that accountants are supposed to paint a picture of what's really going on with your monies. Well, in the Soviet Union and in China, it was, no, that's not how it works. It was sort of like, oh, what do you want? You want a profit this year? You want a loss? Just tell me, we'll come up with the numbers. It's like, no, okay, what do you want? We'll get it, just no problem. That was the whole idea of accounting, to create an image. And if you're a Western investor, you think, oh my gosh, these books look great. Yeah, this is doctor for you. It's very upfront about that. This is a wonderful kind of, this is a world that, you're dealing in. Because you're dealing in this world where things aren't well defined, they try to improve things. And I think what we have here was in the early 1990s, 1993 in particular, the modern enterprise system was enacted. These are, again, legislative things that the government said, thou shalt do. It replaced the prior system. It was supposed to clarify responsibilities for the state and firm management. It was supposed to say, well, what's the role of party and managers, and encourage adoption of new management technologies. And here we're talking about primarily Western technology. The idea is that we're trying to Westernize somewhat, trying to move to markets. Therefore, we must bring in more contemporary HR systems, human resource systems. And it was also trying to establish something that was relatively new: stability, a legal system for property rights and assets. I don't know if you have much contact with textbook writers, but one of the things they always tell you is that you think it's a great thing because your textbook is going to be translated to Chinese. The common experience is that your textbook, which has been translated in Chinese, sells one copy, and there's a run on photocopy paper. And there's a dramatic sense. And if you think about it, remember the movie Harry Potter? They said within a matter of hours you can get a pirated copy on the streets of Shanghai. Just for the sense of, I can pay $100 for an official copy, or $1.50 for a pirated copy. What are you going to do? And that doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Well, some of the idea here was to try to get some stability. This idea of, if you're going to try to draw investors, you're going to try to draw some sense of Western involvement. You just can't play like the Wild West. I think what has happened is that Western ideas are being introduced on a system that is trying to reduce power distances, introduce shorter time orientations, immediate gains. What is going on here is we have this 5,000 years of bureaucracy tradition that is being transformed into this Western idea, and even though the base may be 5,000 years, since the 80s, we're talking over 20 years perhaps, the idea is that, gee, maybe this stuff is taking hold. One of the people who I think is absolutely just brilliant, and as an academic, I consider him just a leader, Marshall Meyer at the Wharton School. He is a sociologist. I consider him a living legend. And Marshall has done a series of interviews with CEOs in China. He tape records these things, are translated, and he gets some of the most insightful, just amazing ideas. Story, Chinese piano company. This is how you do business in China. He asked the CEO of the biggest piano company, builder, whatever they're called, in China, and asking this person, what are you trying to do? What are your goals? And this is not an exaggeration. This guy basically said he wanted to conquer the piano world. This is not, be a player. This is conquer, take over, destroy all other piano companies. This guy was going to be the dominant piano maker. He wanted the best quality, undisputed. When you think about quality, eventually he wants you to think about his company. And he wanted to be both highest quality and a huge volume dealer. This is very difficult to do, but this is his vision. And so they asked him, okay, that's cool. That sounds like what the business people are supposed to do. And this guy was talking about his life and his background, and he came out. He was a true Chinese communist. He believed wholeheartedly what he was doing, that to conquer the piano world was good for society, good for the communist country, and that I was going to tell this joke, but I'm going to lead into it because I don't know if it's going to work. When he bleeds red. Double metaphor, get it? Okay. No more jokes. Okay. The point here is that we have a set of evolving rules here that aren't real clear. A second story. I had the wonderful opportunity to have lunch with the dean of a Chinese business school. This is a guy who is very interesting. He is the current dean of in Beijing of a telecom technology business school. He is the ex-chief strategist for China Telecom. He has a Stanford University Ph.D. in engineering. And I thought, well, okay, it's very impressive credentials. And I was thinking, tell me about life and what you plan to do. And, why do you do this? He says, well, I do this 8 months out of the year. I said, okay. What do you do the other 4 months out of the year? He says, I go home. Oh, where's home? He says he keeps his family in Sunnyvale, California. I thought, wait a minute now. This is just not normal. He says, gosh, he has his family, his couple, 3 kids, wife, living in a just ordinary neighborhood. I grew up in the town next to Sunnyvale, so I know the area where he lives. I actually know the street where he lives. And I was saying, that's a long commute. Sunnyvale, California to Beijing. Why do you do this? He said, and this is one of those dramatic moments, he said he was approximately 55 years old. I think he said 55, 57 years old. And he said he lived through the Cultural Revolution. He said for 10 years he was sentenced to go out on the farm. He'd been a college student, and he had to go out into the middle of nowhere to an area where nobody spoke his local language or really spoke the dominant national language of Mandarin. He had to work the fields in extremely hard labor for 10 years. He said, after you go through that experience, after you live and work and you know that, the bureaucrats are telling you, whatever it takes, use all your intellectual skills, powers, and abilities to not make a decision. He said, should it arise, you wanted to have a place to go. So a well-timed exit was extremely important to him. So he kept his family in Sunnyvale, California. He worked full-time, 8 months a year, in Beijing. And I asked him, well, why do you do this? He said his mother was still in Beijing, so he was there taking care of her because he was the eldest son. He also said he felt he owed it to the society to make it a better place, even though he himself felt he had been cruelly and unfairly treated. But it was something that was just part of him. But, being the wise man that he was, a well-timed exit was always just right there at surface memory. I thought that was profoundly important. Judgment. In academic terms, we call this situation. There are no institutions. So institutions, academically, are defined as those entities which allow legitimization. There's a lot of syllables there, I know. What that means is it's pre-institutional, pre-paradigmatic. There's no dominant rules. There are no rules for how you do things. You just do it. It's a Wild West mentality. The idea is, because they're experimenting, because the idea is they want certain kinds of economic progress, son of a gun, they don't know how they want to do it. So you want to do it, but do it well. And if you do it right, They'll let you do it more. If you do it wrong, they're going to let you know it. The old saying, the more things change, the more things stay the same. That's the same thing they did under Mao, same thing they did early on in Deng Xiaoping, and under the current president, presumably the next president. Issue from studying management. How quickly will dominant rules emerge? Up until the Arthur Anderson Enron fiasco, I would have said, very quickly these rules will emerge. Well, you look at the United States and the accounting rules that presumably had been written in concrete, so they thought, the rules that were supposed to be just no question about fiscal integrity, maybe it was going to take a lot longer than I thought. For the study of management, I think this means that we're trying to study human behavior, we're trying to study thought processes that occur in an environment that is evolving. There are no rules. You do things, and only if you violate some extreme kind of rule do they ding you. Prior to that, if it works, you're in pretty good shape. Any questions on that?
Well, I guess when the guy goes to Stanford and then goes back, although he's taking some perception of other rules with him.
I'm sorry, I didn't...
I say when as many of them have studied in Western universities or worked in Western environments, and then when they go back, they have this set of rules from that context, and
Yes.
then they have to try to merge it in with where they are.
Well,
Try to satisfy the party and all that stuff. It's a pretty nightmarish situation.
If I had to venture a wild guess here, because we're talking about a very ill-defined situation, we're talking about a very ill-defined world, you have all these people who are very smart, studied in the Western context, and taking ideas back. Because they know Chinese culture, management, and their local context, they're trying to adapt it. And how they adapt it is like any entrepreneur, trying to figure out and do the best you can. Some will make it, some of it don't. And I suspect, again, I'm wildly speculating here, that it's a large trial and error process. These guys have gone back and sort of figured out, I think I know what I'm doing, and they then muddle forward. In fact, I'm going to have some evidence here, some data, to talk about what they do when they muddle forward. Did that answer your question? Thank you. I'm going to make a major assertion here. An assertion and running theme about academia. And I believe this to be completely true. By assertion, academically based theories represent the scholar's institutional memory of what we know and a collective direction for what we still need to learn. And as a subtext of that, what do we know and what do we still need to learn? I'm going to assert and sort of lead into what we know may be quite applicable. And the reason I say that are there some basic ideas about people, or some basic ideas about managing people in the Chinese context, but basic principles that hold. I think a casual observation number one that I want to make. Much of our research about China and about Asian management has said, what can we apply directly? What is it that we know, and we'll test it directly in a different context. And I think this particular message here that seems to, I try to convey, is that, son of a gun, we have this perhaps westernized view that China is so wildly different, Vietnam is so wildly different, that all these different countries are so wildly different that we are basically starting from scratch. I think, as a casual observation, that may not be the case. So I want to talk just some examples about direct application of existing and Western-based theory. Oh my gosh, I talk a lot. To research, to Chinese enterprises. This is a study by Dr. Bian, Hong Kong University. She uses the idea of the Western idea of social capital. In our academic terms, this is, or in our non-academic terms, this means who do you know? Who do you know? You can study who do you know in terms of social ties. You can study who do you know in terms of civic involvement. Or you can study who do you know in terms of social wholes, as it's called. People who are tightly connected versus people who are not tightly connected. Now, I don't care whether this is Paris, France, 1800, this is New York City, 1991, or whether this is Vancouver. Who you know matters. Who you know matters. And whether it's China or whether it's a Western society, whether we call it perhaps guanxi, or perhaps simply being connected. The idea here is, if you know people, does it mean something? And in a survey in 188 firms in Guangzhou City, they found that firm performance could be predicted, explained by social capital. What does that mean? That means that based on measures of who you know, who you're connected to, you can predict future firm financial performance. We're not talking attitudes here. We're not talking about perceptions. We're talking about hardcore dollars. So what this means is that we have this basic idea that we claim is Western, but in fact may be universal. Who you know matters. Who you know can get you a whole bunch of dollars. Who you know can get you hurt as well. Takeaway message: understanding Chinese management need not start from scratch. I think the implication is that we may already know some things about Chinese management, and we may know a whole lot about them as well. Another example. Dr. Shi, City University of Hong Kong, took a very Western idea. This is an idea about, this is kind of a complicated phenomenon, a curvilinear or U-shaped relationship between job demands and felt stress. This is a phenomenon that is hypothesized in the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Netherlands. I mean, this has been statistically shown. Its principle is too little job demands, high stress occurs because of feelings of monotony. Too many job demands, and high stress occurs because of overload. Some modest level of job demands leads to low to modest stress. So you need some stressors in there, some degree of something to energize you, but you can't have too little or too small. Well, they took this idea. In 1999, a survey of 1,100 full-time employees from a number of Chinese cities across a number of different categories, and they statistically found what is true in Europe, in North America, a variety of countries. The U-shaped relationship was found. You, in fact, had different causes of stress leading to sometimes negative, sometimes positive, and sometimes a non-relationship depending on the degree of stress there. I think the takeaway message, there is another datum that says that understanding Chinese management may not be so complicated. I think, I certainly did this up until very recently, typically assume that Western research does not apply in the Chinese context, that it was largely an empirical question. We had to check it out. I think the emerging effort of checking out means that maybe we know a whole lot about it already, and that we may not be, our initial guesses may not be too far off. I have a lot of reason to feel quite optimistic. Oops. Well, casual observation number 2. In addition to seeking and studying similarities, some scholars of Chinese management have studied Western-based ideas to create new insights on Chinese management. They've taken multiple Western concepts and tried to apply them in the Chinese context. It's not been done in the Western context, so it's sort of new ideas. Xiaoping Chen, University of Washington, a colleague of mine, studied the phenomenon of transactional and transformational leadership on turnover. Transactional leadership is what the economists tell us is eyeball to eyeball. You want to negotiate up front and honestly, as much as possible. You give me X, I'll give you Y. Straight economic exchange. We know from Western research and Western theory, you can't always specify everything up front. The economists call that transaction costs. You can't lay them out. Sociologists, they come up with this kind of cutesy idea. They call it markets and plans. If you have so much complexity, the market tends to break down, and you try to negotiate stuff, and you get more like a family-run organization where trust and familiarity occur. Remember that saying I said earlier? The more things change, the more things stay the same. Some people might use the word blanchi. Some people may use the word social identity. Some people may use the word familiarity. But the idea here is the notion of trust. Here we're talking about measures of transformational and transformational means that idea of inspiring people. That idea of getting people to rise above what they are and do things because they want to, do things because they trust you, because they do things because they fundamentally believe it's the right thing to do. It is not an economic exchange. You're not saying I'm doing this because I'm going to get paid. There might be that expectation, but you haven't negotiated up front. You're doing it because you trust the other party to a large extent. Inspiring and intrinsically motivating acts. with 175 employees in 4 firms. This is the traditional design. They took a survey, questions for feelings or attitudes and reactions, behaviors, acts of transactional and transformational leadership. They monitored a number of people, 175 people in this case, and saw who quit. They compared the two, and they found that. I think this is rather profound. This is a typo also. It says, it should say, transformational leadership acts decrease turnover, whereas transactional leadership acts increase turnover. What that means is that under those conditions where you're being inspired, under those conditions where you feel like you're doing it because you trust them, you're doing it because of guanxi, you're doing it because of social familiarity, you're doing it because of connectedness to other people, you'll want to stay. And behaviorally, people stay. If you do things in terms of negotiating economic exchange, once the economic exchange is completed, perhaps people leave. These are statistical findings that are significant in a Chinese culture. We do not know if they apply in a Western culture. I think a very profound, for me, takeaway message is that in the Chinese context, we learn that behavior and the study of behavior and these theories can go both ways, across the oceans. We traditionally think, and this is a very, very, I think, biased Western view, that we're going to ship over all these management ideas, but in fact, the learning goes both ways. The learning goes both ways.
When was this done?
This one was done, I just read the study, it was done no earlier than 1999. It might have been done in the year 2000, but I just don't know. 99 or 2000. This next person, Ping Ping, she goes by PP of all things, Chinese University of Hong Kong. She did something profoundly different. Everything else I've talked about is traditional statistical surveys. Here she talked about in high-tech firms, does the management style of the top management team differ or is similar to Western high-tech firms? And her and her team did extensive reading of Chinese and Western research literatures on it. They induced a model, and against 2 waves of focus group data and individual interviews, they found evidence for decision-making processes that basically say leader, member, team activities. Summarizing there is highly educated, high energy, high commitment, technically oriented, and younger people were the people involved. They were driven, they were having fun, and they were energizing people. A series that led to team processes that can be characterized as less constrained by convention. They found that if in these top management teams, if the authority was pushed down to the lower level of the top management team, you had increased or moderated effects with these kinds of outcomes: team satisfaction, member satisfaction, better productivity. Now, what is important here to note is that this could be Silicon Valley. This could be Boston's Route 128. Enormous similarity of top management teams in Western high-tech companies. Here we get to the idea of this is derived from interviews, eyeball-to-eyeball conversations, reading Chinese materials. Does it apply in the US, Canada, and European firms? On the face of it, this is extremely similar to what's going on in high-tech Western firms. The point here, again, is that what we're finding slowly is learning is occurring across both sides, and there is a substantial amount of similarity. Well, I have to also tell you then that it's not as pretty a picture as I painted, in the sense that Catherine Shin, she is a professor at China Europe International Business School, formerly at University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong. She has this dramatic story. I've never asked her age, but I'm guessing she's in her 30s, and she also lived through the Cultural Revolution. But she tells a story that as a young person in China, she watched her parents be beaten physically during the Cultural Revolution and broken psychologically, with which they may never have recovered in the 60s and 70s. Catherine studies China in part because She wants economic and personal freedoms in China, and she sees this as her way of making some sort of contribution. She wanted to study corporate culture in Chinese firms, corporate culture. And I think what she did was she interviewed wave after wave after wave of Chinese managers, learning through each process, and her research is summarized through this kind of list, which I think is, quite frankly, rather profound. What we have here are, on the right, on this my left-hand side, this column here, are common Western corporate culture dimensions. Western corporate culture dimensions. And she found both Chinese counterparts, but she also found subtle differences. And these subtle differences would only be discovered in eyeball-to-eyeball conversations, eyeball-to-eyeball asking people what's going on. For example, I won't go through this whole thing, but I think in Western culture, one of the things we try to do, whether we do it or not, it's a different issue, but we try to have respect for people. If you look at what is my right-hand side, the Chinese dimensions, she finds something called employee dimension, employee development. Respect for people, employee development are she saw as very comparable kinds of ideas. Yet, if you look at the Chinese version, it goes far deeper than employee development. It goes far deeper. It's talking about a balance between participation and decision-making, trying to get at character development. In the United States, if you did character development, somebody would throw a lawsuit on you so fast that you wouldn't know what hit you. However, in China, the idea is you've got to be more concerted. What this is called guanxi, whether it's called familiarity, whether it's called trust, it is relationship-oriented. So talking about organization, person linkages, it goes much deeper. And I think, just if you, I don't know if you can read this, scanning some of this list, the lower part, you find in the, what is that word called? Italicized text. Those are the uniquely Chinese characteristics. And all those things are talking about trying to be more concerned about the person, going to a greater depth. The fundamental general dimensions hold, but taking it to more depth of interpersonal relations seem to define Chinese characteristics. I think this is rather profound. The reason I think it's rather profound is because we're saying there are enormous similarities, what we find with our survey research, but we probe deeper, we find in the interview format, or what is called the qualitative research approach, that oftentimes the nuances or the subtleties is for deeper interpersonal relations, deeper sense of connectedness than what you might get in a Western kind of organization. For American, Canadian, Western managers, unless you're somehow sensitized to this deeper assumption, deeper level of connectedness across persons, you may not be taken quite so seriously. So what do we know? What do we know? A conservative statement, I think, is understanding Chinese management need not start from scratch, from minimal knowledge. We know perhaps a whole lot. I think we can say that existing theory and research constitute very good starting points for understanding Chinese management. And if you're a radical, if you want to go on a limb, you could say a generous statement might be, we know a whole heck of a lot about Chinese American firms. We just need to tease out some of the subtleties, the issues of depth, how far you take our existing Western ideas. What we still need to learn, although useful, I think existing research from the Western context provides an incomplete lens. This is an academic requirement. You gotta say this because it's true, but you gotta say it because they slap you on the face if you don't. More research needs to be done. That's a fancy way of saying we got to tease out some of the subtleties. I think future scholarship should study the boundaries of existing theory and research. Look for uniquely Chinese aspects of our existing Western knowledge. I think also that in 5 years, that should stop. There's this real danger if you keep studying the same thing over and over again, you're just going to reinvent the wheel. I think that there's some sort of notion that at some point, say 5 years, I'm arbitrarily picking a number, if you stop studying the Chinese phenomena and look for something uniquely Chinese, you're going to get a better handle on it. And I can't emphasize, this is from my own personal and experience of just talking to other people, son of a gun, this is fun. I mean, I can't tell you, studying and understanding Chinese phenomena is fun. Part of this is my personal background, but it is kind of interesting information. Earlier, somebody was saying, just to go to a real Szechuan restaurant and eat Szechuan food and burn your guts out, I mean, well, it hurts. Yeah, it really burns your mouth out, but it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Just experiencing, learning, seeing, talking to different mindsets, different mentalities is just really fun. So I think academically, financially, fiscally, etc., there are a lot of good reasons to study Chinese management. But I do not want to lose sight of it. It is also, quite frankly, a lot of fun. Just to see and interact with a different segment of humanity and to learn there's a whole lot of commonality, an enormous amount of commonality, and then to tease out some of the differences there. So with that, I want to say thank you for coming. I sincerely appreciate it. And ask for any questions. Yes, please.
All of this, or most of the sources, if not all, you quoted are actually Western-based. Is there a whole body of research being done in China itself on the subject?
Yes and no. Chinese management schools are coming into the 21st century. Up until quite recently, by quite recently I mean yesterday, very recent stuff, there has been a recognition that what they did was write opinion pieces. You would get professors who, by Chinese tradition, who are highly thought of, espouse wisdom based on what they thought was going on, and that's what they were supposed to do. I think the Chinese government has recognized that the more westernized scientific study of management is what is necessary. And they have a large population of people who aren't qualified to do that. And so they're investing substantial amounts of money. A lot of the projects that I talked about are done by Chinese professors trained in America. It's a real problem in China right now because, and I think I call this sort of the MTV phenomenon. You have a lot of people from inland China who go to Peking University because it's the most glamorous, it's the best school. Then they say, oh, okay, I'll be there for a few years. Then they want to go to Hong Kong because of the Western influence, the resources, and the money. And they say, well, gosh, that's good, but then maybe I should go to a school in the U.S., Indiana University, some very fine universities, University of Washington. You may want to go to UBC, Simon Fraser, wherever. And they say, well, geez, this is pretty nice. I don't want to go back. And there's this kind of brain drain. It's a real serious issue there. They're taking a number of different steps, like saying, you got to come back. They're taking steps like they're trying to make financial arrangements much more lucrative. At the Academy of Management is a professional association of management professors, for example. And Peking University put on this breakfast, and they're talking about the financial incentives to go to Peking University for several years and do research and how you would benefit financially and be part of this greater structure. And they were really putting quite a sell on it. I thought it was pretty spiffy when they talked about it. I think it's recognized that they're going to westernize to some extent, Chinese style. They're going to bring in Western ideas about human resource management. I think the sense there is that they got to figure out how to do it, and the way they're going to have to figure out how to do it is to try and bring in these management techniques and the study of management. Most of these projects, if not all of them that I talked about, were heavily funded by the Chinese government. Big dollar grants to individuals, or to schools, who then turned around and gave it to individuals.
Perhaps could I throw a piece of reaction to this? I think this question about the extent to which, even though, yes, these are all China-born, raised scholars, they're educated in the West, I've heard similar types of complaints from researchers in Europe, where in order to get published in the leading journals in management, which happen to be American journals, they somehow have to conform to the American mold. You have to engage in certain types of empirical research, write in certain format,
Right.
And so on and so forth. So in a sense, the types of findings, so I'm not finding fault with the kind of research that they're doing, but in order to get published in prestigious journals, they have to conform to the North American
Yes.
mold. And I've heard a lot of European scholars complain about this too. For instance, some of the leading scholars in Europe, they say that when they look at human resource management, it really is quite different from the American human resource management model. But in order to get published in a U.S. journal, somehow we have to
Yes.
modify, change, whatever, in order to conform to that mode. So in a sense, it's almost like we're forcing them to fit into this particular mode, which then might in turn lead to
Yes.
the kinds of conclusions that you're talking about.
This is a long-term debate in the academic study of management. The best journals, the most prestigious journals, the most visible journals are English language, primarily American-based. As a result, you have to fit into a certain model. If you don't follow the formula, you're not going to get in. There is a great deal of truth to that. Things change very slowly, and I think Chinese management professors are sensitized to this. First one is that several of the examples I presented are traditionally qualitative research. Those, up until very recently, have been seen as sort of second-class citizens. But they provided a different look at the phenomena of interest. And I think in the year 2002, these are now valued. In my role as editor of the Academy of Management Journal, which is one of the more prestigious management journals in the world, we're very open to this. Now, I'm only one person, and I'm only an editor for 3 years. And so what I do has potentially, it ends when I step down. But I think there's a greater sensitivity to more models. That's very unsatisfying to the person who does something and gets it rejected. You say, well, we're sensitive to what you're doing as we reject you. That's not a comforting idea, but nonetheless, there is some greater sensitivity to that. And people are doing different kinds of research. I think also it is an evolutionary process. To understand the phenomena, I think academia has to be big enough to be able to say, okay, we have to move to different techniques and different models. You can't plug in a certain statistic all the time and get a meaningful outcome and not reinvent the wheel. I think where they teased out the subtleties in Chinese management is when they talked to people, watched people, whether it's Marshall Meyer or Ping Ping, talking to people and getting a sense of what are the subtle similarities and differences. A coarse-grained approach of just doing more surveys to get similar results. When you probe beyond the coarse-grained surveys, you tend to get these subtle differences that I think are really insightful for similarities and differences. So it's a problem, I think, absolutely, but I think it's a problem that management, the gatekeeping systems are becoming increasingly sensitive to, and over time it will resolve itself. It's a lousy answer because it says that since you're talking 10, 15 years from now. But nonetheless, I think it really is happening. Other questions, please? Yes, please.
May I comment a little bit also here? I came from Finland, which is quite close to Norway, and I speak a little bit Finnish, and I did my consultation for Finnish companies because Finland is a very much export-oriented country, and China is now their second biggest market overseas. And during my research, because Finland is in Europe, not in North America, that's why I know a little bit about the recent studies on the management in Europe. From the 1970, Hofstede from Holland, he did the study for IBM across 50 countries. That time not in China, because IBM not yet in China. But he found that his theory, as you said, his theory and research cannot fit China, cannot explain China when China opened the door. And he did a cooperative research with Michael Bond from the Hong Kong Chinese University. And they add one dimension. You mentioned one dimension, long power distance. Big power distance, small power distance. He add one dimension, is long-term orientation dimension. They call that Confucianism or something like that. And this is one contribution Europeans, they did the theory. Next guy who is now the rival of Hofstede is Trompenaar, and also from Holland. And he did this study in the 1990s and very well organized before that. And also at the same time he studied China, and in his research he found that China, as part of, you mentioned, China is scattered. He said we cannot paint one Chinese in a whole, and they are returnees, a very influential group, some kind of like the management school dean. He's also a returnee, or he's a flying guy. between continents. And he also divided that to local company or joint venture company. I noticed one study your colleague did in Zhejiang province. I suppose that's like a local company, and the piano story is a local company. While the mainstream nowadays in bigger cities in China, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, they are more joint venture or totally foreign invested companies. And what I would like to emphasize a very good research is Schwarz, a Austria. He did that research together with some Chinese scholars, and I also applied his research in mine. He made a value system which is quite simple. 8 values everybody has, and but everybody have different tensions in these values. And he found that China is just located opposite to the west, to the western, and just like east and west. And this can explain a lot. It's a quite powerful theory.
Say that one again, please.
Schwarz, I have the reference in my computer. I cannot remember his name.
The gist of it again. What was
The value system. The value system, for example, 4 dimensions and 8 values. To the left or to the west, let's say, it's like openness, and up is like self, and down is like common, and over there is a little bit like close, but there's no extreme actually. And then he did interviews with top CEOs and asked, okay, not directly what kind of value do you have, because it's difficult to survey people's value, but from behavior and attitude, you can test the values. So he found that Westerners are more open, but self-oriented. So let's say the west part or the west-north part. And Chinese, also in his study, the Japanese, it's like the southeast part, southeast part. Like a little bit conservative, but first of all, think about the group. This also explains the Chinese one sheep. Chinese never think they are an individual. They must come from one family, and they must have very comprehensive and complex social links with the others. So they should behave not only according to their own choice, but behave to the common, like live. It's not a proper word, like community, or let's say group. And so this, let's say, can explain a little bit, like your first story, like he's making no choice, because how could you make a choice for a billion people? So no choice is the best choice. So did I explain?
I understand.
Yeah, and for Northern Americans, Bennett and Bennett, not far away from Washington, they set up this ICI Institute, Intercultural Communication Institute, ICI, and they are training also Chinese managers, which is not very much based on existing Western theory or practice, but listen to the Chinese managers and find out what is the best way to make them and their foreign counterparts understand each other.
Where is this ICI?
I don't remember the exact place, but I can send email to you.
No, but is it
China, it's no.
It's pretty close to Portland.
Sorry?
Yeah,
Portland?
Portland. It's exactly in Portland.
That's the place that has the beautiful downtown university instead of 5 different ones like we have.
Yeah, it's exactly in Portland, and usually every summer they organize that kind of summer school, especially for Chinese.
You tapped on a real sensitive issue for social science broadly defined. How generalizable are the theories and the results? For example, One of my personal pet gripes is, to the extent, is northern China, southern China, are they similar to the point where you can make generalizations? Just like, can we make generalizations about British Columbia people versus people on the East Coast? You always hear these tensions like two Canadas, you know, you have East Coast people, you have British Columbia people, then I suppose you have Quebec people too, but so you have all these different groups. Are those differences within Canada so profound that they have more meaning than Canada versus other places? Same thing in China. This Toisan people are supposed to be brutish and crude and just the working class hoi polloi, so to speak. And there's the old saying in Beijing that China stops at Shanghai and everything below there is a wilderness. So I've always wondered, to what extent, most of this research comes from the urban areas. It comes from the cities. So does it apply to smaller rural areas? We just don't know. I think one emphasis there is that, you know, you could say, well, that's an empirical question. You have to study that phenomenon to get a handle on it. Yes, that's absolutely true. We don't have any good explanation for these other than very crude group member, you know, you're from southern China, from northern China. Comment or question?
Yeah, just to add a couple of things bouncing around here. First of all, be very careful because it seems it's very important to make sure we understand what our spheres of relativity and relevance are when you're discussing even northern and southern or eastern and western China or anywhere else. It's a huge country. But if you're talking about the relationship that that country as a country is having with other countries as countries, then you have to come to some determination as to its cultural basis. So the question is, what level are you prepared? But more importantly, I think it's very important to avoid falling into a trap when you're talking about, even talking about Japan and China having some similarities. And I think that is really dangerous because it doesn't take much to look at Hofstede's data and understand that Japan and China or Taiwan and Hong Kong and Korea all fall into totally different cultural spheres. And it doesn't take much except looking at his own figures to see that they are not anywhere near each other culturally, for his data, then they're not near each other at all. And so it becomes a really dangerous pitfall to even start to think in terms of this Asian collectivism or collective mindset or attitude. And when you start thinking that way, it's disastrous. Now, if you're just looking at the simple dimensions, or I say simple not in a negative sense, but the minimal dimensions that he's dealing with, those can be very useful for getting a picture. And those pictures paint very distinct differences even in East Asia. And they're very useful for understanding similarities between different East Asian countries and different Western countries. And it seems very obvious if you look at that level that they're sharing something profoundly common. But what's common between someone like Korea and Brazil is totally different than what's common between Japan and Germany. And those are the commonalities that fall out of his data.
It's interesting. I teach in this Korean program at the University of Washington, where we have the LG group and a large number of Koreans come in. And I'm born and raised on the west coast of the United States. And so for me, it was always Chinese New Year. And so, you know, big event, celebrate, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to my Korean students, yeah, Chinese New Year, it's good, you know, gotta celebrate. What are you guys gonna do? They sort of looked at me like, what's Chinese New Year's? What do you mean, what's Chinese New Year's? He says, you mean the Lunar New Year? I said, oh yeah, I've never heard the term Lunar New Year. 2 weeks ago, I was talking to the students who I will teach in April, and we were sort of talking about, I have converted, I said, the Lunar New Year, and he sort of looked at me. I said, do you mean the Korean New Year? So I don't know what to say, but the level of, this is the worldview of these different entities, Korean versus the United States versus China. You know, Chinese New Year's is a major league event. This Lunar New Year is a major league event throughout Asia, but how they frame it was so different by culture. It really brought home that in the United States, at least, I do not know about Canada, but the United States, we sort of lumped it all together. And that is very, very dangerous. I absolutely agree.
Well, I find one of the biggest problems that I'm having myself, and that is what this notion of dimensions is. because it's being used for everything you can think about, and there's been, to my understanding, no agreement on what a dimension really is, because it's used from everything like behaviors to values, for underlying core values, to whether you use chopsticks or a fork and knife. I mean, and the professionals who are out there writing literature are using them in every which way themselves, and no one has come down and said, well, let's agree that we have some fundamental rules on definitions even. And that's where I'm having a real problem.
Let me answer that. I think I can answer it. That'll be somewhat unsatisfying.
That's what I'm looking for.
When you use the word dimension, whether one likes it or not, these statisticians have taken over the world. And the statisticians, in the sense of applied statisticians, psychologists, sociologists, all the various ologists, a dimension as a certain statistical defining characteristic. It is, you have this highly intercorrelated set of attributes, items, questions, and that the correlations within the dimension will be much, much greater than correlations between dimensions. That's a very classic statistical definition. That's very antiseptic. When you start trying to apply that to sort of common discourse and what it really means, that's the starting point for what you mean, and you can add literary license to make it fuzzier. But the idea is, at least we know a statistical definition for it seems to be the common way to approach it.
How meaningful is someone who's talking about 10 or 12 dimensions like House, and someone who's talking about 4 like Hofstede, and then his incorporate Hofstede's, and they add something more, and somewhere there, and you don't know what you're comparing anymore.
Yeah. I think this is also very unsatisfying, but I think the academic answer is that there is an increasing number of studies that express the same frustration you have, that every time you turn around there's a different set of dimensions, and trying to identify communalities that may cut across whatever unit you're interested in, countries.
Can I make a proposition to you?
Yes, please.
Can I suggest that if we look at nature, that when you look at something that's in 2 dimensions, then when you move to a 3rd dimension, you're not simply adding something from outside, because there is nothing outside of the dimensionality. That is, in order to evoke a 3rd dimension, you have to transform the existence of the first 2 dimensions. So they are no longer there in the 3rd dimension because you've taken something out of each dimension to create the 3rd.
Yes.
Therefore, your 3 dimensions have nothing identical with the first 2. That is, you're not extrapolating something external to them to add a 3rd dimension. Now, when you're adding the 4th dimension to the first 3, if you're adding 2 dimensions, you can no longer take something external to the first 3 and add it in. You must transform those 3, lose them in the process, and have 4 dimensions. And the more you go on, if you're dealing with authentic dimensions, even in your measurable items, the more you must buy into that particular philosophy or construct. Otherwise, you're dealing with illusions, and you're talking subdimensions and dimensions, and you're mixing subdimensions and dimensions together. And therefore, how can you compare things that are equal when you're taking 2 real dimensions, and the 3rd one, dividing it in 2, adding them, making them equal, and then measuring them in various statistical analysis, and giving them equal values that they don't have, and you're adding something that's not real anymore. And how do you deal with that?
Well, let me give it this is one of those, this shows my ignorance here perhaps, but last summer I was blithely going along thinking that the world had plants and animals. There were plant kingdom and animal kingdom. And I thought that was reality. And I was at the Academy of Management meetings, and I was talking to, of all people, a former botanist. And I said, well, I know all about biology. You got plants, you got animals. What else do you need to know? And then this person said, what's wrong with you? There are 5 kingdoms. That was the first time I ever heard that. There are 5 kingdoms? I said, what are they? And she said, something to the effect, I may get this wrong, plants, animals, 2 forms of fungi, and then bacteria or something like this. And I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, the whole world just changed on me because I thought there were plants and animals. And we were sort of talking about, I said, okay, these are, I realize, arbitrary distinctions that people are using. And I said, well, why do they have to have 5? Why can't they stick with 2? And that idea was, it makes it easier to understand if you have these 5 different categories. So part of the reason why there's so many dimensions, a number of people believe it helps you understand and make sense of the world. It causes confusion when everybody has all their different dimensions, but to the extent that somebody imposes dimensions, it's supposed to be done because it helps clarify matters. A number of scholars are frustrated and trying to reduce the number of dimensions to some sort of understandable, tractable sense, because with the danger of having dimensions in the abstract, they get so many of them, you don't know what the heck you're talking about anymore.
Harmony is manageable.
That is a tough question. I really don't know.
There's something I want to add, just coming at it from a slightly different context. I've done studies in India, not to do with management per se within business, but I'm an environmental ecologist, so I've been trying to study how to incorporate conservation into the ethics of Indians. And it's, in terms of dimensions, you've got so many different things within one country, but there isn't even a word in Indian for environment. How on earth then do you try and put all these kind of models into practice in a country where there is no environment? Because depending on where you come from, what kind of religion, what area of the country, I'm part of this desk environment, that desk is part of my environment. But there isn't a collective word for that, because if you believe that, you believe that. Whereas the next person coming in the door, there's no such thing as environment, everything's by itself. So when you try and incorporate even that kind of philosophy into looking at things which are then, subdivided and trying to put one or two different people's models into how to even go about discussing it to start with, it just brings it crashing down anyway. I mean, you've got to take, I think, everything we've been talking about and put it into the context of the individual thing you're looking at as well. Because people don't tend to do that. They see a model they like, and they try and make everything fit it. You're automatically getting rid of all of those solutions which are coming from the area which you're looking at anyway. I don't know if other people have found that frustrating, but sticking with one particular viewpoint that somebody came up with, which was great for one particular area, and trying to automatically make it fit somewhere else.
Does not always work, yes.
You're getting rid of a lot of knowledge, indigenous knowledge. You said both sides are obviously trying to find a goal. Maybe the goal isn't the same, but you can still learn. I think you touched on that. In this international realm of management, we run into this problem all the time. What do words mean? Dimensionalization problems. And I don't know whether this makes sense or not. We always talk about you have to have a certain amount of cultural sensitivity. You have to have a certain amount of tolerance for ambiguity, and you have to have a lot of that in social science, particularly in management research. But I think what's important for try to understand this stuff as we move forward and we try to incorporate knowledge about China, knowledge about Asia, it becomes increasingly important that we do reach some sort of agreement on what our terms mean, reach some sort of agreement that we just don't introduce another word, that there's some sort of value added to what's going on. And I think because the study of Chinese management is so new and is in truly its infancy, that the opportunity arises that it can, though I'm not real optimistic, get some level of clarity without reinventing the wheel. I wasn't going to say this, but because I'm on tape there. But at first, I think Hofstadter's dimensions, which is one of the most profound, kind of important pieces of research in international management ever.
Actually, Hofstadter was here last month.
Yeah.
The difficulty with that is that he was too influential, too profound, and people in general haven't been smart enough to go to what's next. Every once in a while, you get some research, some thinking, some idea that is so powerful, it just kills everything, just stops everything. Because people say, that's truth with a capital T, and just trying to tease out the subtleties involved. International management, the study of it, was also affected similarly. This guy did a magnificent piece of research, did everything right, and certainly by no fault of his own, everybody fixated on it, and weren't able to go beyond. And it's taken almost 20 years before people start getting off the dime and trying to figure out, oh yeah, we haven't moved beyond.
If I may take a different field in which I was very familiar some years ago, marketing, and when we define customers, we use dimensions also to define the customers. And then like you have this demographic, psychographic, you have geographic, and you have urban versus non-urban, right? And within each of those, within psychographic, you have 5 different classes. And within demographic, you have, again, 10 different classes. And it's getting to what you're saying. It's very true. Okay, which one works the best? Well, my answer to this is depending which industry you are. You will use different type. If you're selling soap, for example, you'll use geographic. If you're selling cars, you use psychographic. And therefore, you have to sort of adapt that overall model that has maybe together 25 different dimensions with 5 major dimensions, with 5 sub-dimensions, and you adapt it to a given industry and what works for you. And that's it, within that industry. But if you try to find one answer for all industries, psychographic doesn't work at all if you're selling paper, for example. It's demographic there, and that goes on like this. So that's it. What works for you? And, it'd be nice maybe to have a model that works for everybody else, but I think we're doing a good call in that case. So it comes on to what you just said.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing earlier too, in the sense that we were talking about the major cultural differences still between Korea, Japan, and all that sort of stuff. But when you talk about business, probably small business persons around the world find that they have more in common than, say, big management people around the world. And their particular microculture is probably one where you would find areas of similarity and dissonance.
Fukuyama talks about the Asian model, management model, you may have heard of it. He calls the Asian model as the hub and spoke. Well, in North America, we don't have the hub and spoke. Well, forget me, but any major firm that's mid-size and below is hub and spoke system also. So it's not difficult to China. Hub and spoke is difficult to China, maybe the major corporation. But it is difficult to the Western world also when you talk about a smaller firm. And I think a smaller firm share more in common.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
You know what's wrong with this Hofstede? Because his research objective was wrong and has been wrong for a long time. He wants to paint a world map, okay? But I think his research can only guide to some solution. If you want to paint a world map, you need really a good dimension. Or you say, okay, this world is 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, or you project the global, the 3-dimension global, to 2-dimension piece of paper, right? And this world is moving, and we have the 4th dimension, or I don't know how many at all altogether. But Hofstede wants to put everything in his matrix. Okay, masculine, feminism, power distance, blah, 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 these. Okay, China here, and USA here. So that's the word. That's wrong. And what I tell you, one research we did with the United States, Hong Kong, Finland, and China. And what we found, we videotaped top managers' presentation, and we exchanged between these sides. And what we found, interestingly, is that all the other managers, we play the video to the other managers, and all the other managers think Beijing, the manager from Beijing, the Chinese, is more like a Finnish manager from Finland, from Helsinki, than Hong Kong Chinese. The Hong Kong Chinese is more like a Northern American manager. Okay, they even be more exaggerated, like they speak even faster than native speakers. They use a lot of abbreviation without explanation. Okay, this is TDA, this is what, and okay, we don't know, and they apply a lot advanced technology in their presentation. And what we find is that if we use Hofstede's dimension, we really cannot paint the map. Okay, where is Chinese? But if we think our research is only to guide for some solution, like if Hong Kongese and Beijingese will work together, what kind of problem they will have, and how to solve these problems, then we will say that, okay, we study the attitudes towards each other. Because if a Japanese study the Chinese management, if a European study Chinese management, they will have different results. Because, let's say, because of the war, okay, because of the history, Chinese and the Japanese, they have quite complex feeling. Mm-hmm. And to a thing, although there's only one country between China and Finland, they don't have special attitude towards China. And now it's a market, and they go there to business. Okay, so that's the difference. And we apply dimensions from different theories to explain what's these attitudes, what's behind the values, or what kind of behavior they are going to have. But we don't say, okay, this is the truth, this is the word, and this is the map. That's what's my understanding of this, like how to resolve this dimension, how to say dilemma or something. Shall we apply dimension or not?
The corporate world has no problem with different dimensions. They just take what they like.
How are we doing on time?
research issues that pertain to China and Asia. And
Oh, thank you.
okay, this is the
Thank you very much for coming.
What does the ICI mean? What's the word?